he had been deliberately cooling Mao off. He kept him in his own dacha, his own summer house outside of Moscow, but he had no program. He had no state visits. He had nothing to do except, as he later said, to watch old movies, and he could do that in Beijing. Stalin finally sent a reporter from Pravda out to talk to Mao, and Mao said that it was so boring and nothing was happening, and that if it didn't change, he was going to go back to Beijing. That broke the spell.
It was not until Zhou Enlai came to Moscow 1 month after Mao's arrival that the deadlocked negotiations began to go smoothly. In the treaty they signed, it was decided that the Soviet Union would retain the special rights that Imperial Russia had acquired in the northeastern Xinjiang in return for providing China with economic aid. Although the Western world believed China and the Soviet Union were firmly united, Salisbury was convinced that Mao's distrust and dislike for Stalin had grown. After the founding of the People's Republic, the first task Mao took on was rural reform.
His study was seminal. No one before had ever made so close an examination of the peasant and what his wants and desires were, exactly what he wanted the world to be. Marx, Lenin, and Stalin preached that the revolution must be based on the cities and the working class. This attitude defined the total failure by Moscow and Moscow's Chinese trainees to understand anything about China. In the mid-1920s, China was still 90 to 95% peasant. In China's history, it was the peasants, in every instance, who had risen up against oppression, opposed imperial rule, and given their masters a new and bloody lesson. Mao's doctrine was simple: to meet the needs and demands of the peasants. Freedom from the moneylenders, freedom from the landlords who had sweated and oppressed them, the elimination of the landlords from China.
Jintang, Sichuan province. Here, in the early stages of the revolution, distribution of land to peasants was carried out according to the land reform law Mao had proclaimed in 1950. It was a typical Chinese village where the landlords, who formed only 10% of the total population, had owned 90% of the land. Zheng Ronghai, farmer. When the new China came into being, he was a poor peasant who scarcely had any land of his own. Even today, Zheng keeps this land certificate as his treasured possession. This certificate enabled Zheng to own his land and earn a living from it. These certificates also put an end to the feudal landlord system. It was an unexpectedly difficult task to enforce land reform in this vast territory. Many remote villages were not even aware of the founding of the People's Republic. The Great Land Reform, a documentary film which focused on Jintang, begins with scenes of the arrival of propaganda and organizing teams trained at party headquarters. The mission of such teams was to persuade peasants to break with the landlord system and to gain the land for themselves.
Propaganda and organizing teams moved step by step with the military on the Long March and in the Liberation War. No sooner was a village or a rural area occupied than the peasants were organized into work teams, production units, labor assistance groups. The land was taken over from the owners. With the aid and encouragement of party workers, the peasants relentlessly rooted out landlords, their families, and henchmen. There was no mercy for the owning class. The concept of a good landlord was not recognized. Mao's vision, as presented in the report, was clear, precise, and accurate. He said, "In a very short time, several 100 million peasants will rise like a storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it at bay. Do not," he exhorted, "worry about excess or mistakes in the heat of battle." Mao wrote, "A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely, and so gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, magnanimous. A revolution is an act of violence and insurrection."
Land reform strengthened the base of Mao's newly established regime. He won the absolute support of the peasants who formed 90% of the total population of China. The Great Land Reform depicts in detail the process of land redistribution. The propaganda and organizing teams stayed in the village for some months and grouped peasants into three classes: rich, middle, and poor. Peasants preferred to be classified as poor because the poorer were treated better by the land reform program. Not only land, but farm implements, animals, and even furniture were distributed to peasants. The reform raised the morale of the peasants, and in the 3 years after the founding of the People's Republic, food production increased by 40%, greatly surpassing the highest level of the pre-liberation era.
The land reform was the most important single aspect of Mao's revolutionary policy. It was very simple. He let the peasants take the land, take it away from the landowners, the big owners, the estates, the feudal system of China, gave it to them. That's what the peasants wanted, and they became automatically 100% supporters of the new regime, of the new China. And since they constituted perhaps 90% of the population, Mao was assured of a solid backing of China. It produced the best years as they look back upon it, as the peasants look back on it. Those early years after the revolution, when they had the land and were exploiting it themselves as individual peasants, they look back on those times as probably the best that they had had. It was a shining success compared with some of the forced measures which had been taken in the Soviet Union in order to collectivize the peasants.
If you find things in your neighborhood getting a little bit dull, enter the exciting world of people and lights at City Plaza.